But I didn't. And so I didn't finish that book. Nothing could happen with it. I went back to Australia and I wrote other things. I wrote various stories and so on. But in fact, my next publication is also a book you'll have never seen here. This is quite an unusual little book. Again, it started off as an exercise in self-publishing, though it then ended up being published by someone else. And in 1988, this is really my first book. It's called Very Clever Baby's First Reader. And some friends of mine were having a baby, and they were sure that that baby would be the cleverest baby ever born. And I thought, well, I'm sure that's true, that baby will be immensely clever. So I made them a little card, just a little card book to say congratulations on the birth of their baby. And this little book, Very Clever Baby's First Reader, features Freddy the Fish and his easy words. And it begins, "This is Freddy Fish. The study of fish is called ichthyology." And it goes on to things like, "Freddy is called a fish because he is a completely aquatic vertebrate." Now, interestingly, and it says it's for very clever babies aged 3 to 6 months. Now, I made this for my friend's Very Clever Baby, and then I made some more because other people were having children. And I ended up having to make these little booklets all the time for friends who were having babies who wanted to have one to give to their child. And then I ended up self-publishing it, and then, in fact, an Australian publisher took them on as well. But a bookseller friend of mine who sold them said it's very interesting because roughly about 20% of the people who picked up this book just didn't get it. They'd look at it and they'd open it and they'd read ichthyology. And so, but a baby couldn't read that. There's no way a baby could read ichthyology. And then the bookseller would point out that babies can't read at all. That actually is the joke. And they'd look blankly back at him and say, "But babies can't read ichthyology." So it's an interesting test. So that was actually my very first book. And it was followed by Very Clever Baby's Ben-Hur, with Freddy the Fish as Charlton Heston. And that begins with, "This is Ben-Hur, he is a prince of Jerusalem." He's also a fish. And followed by, and this is very much ahead of its time, I felt, Very Clever Baby's Guide to the Greenhouse Effect, with Professor Frederick Fish. So, in around 1988 to 1990, those were the books that, in fact, I was known for in Australia. And I started to think, and I was writing a novel at that time, and I started to think, oh dear, I'm going to be known for these funny little joke books about very clever babies that sit next to the till. I'm never going to have a proper book published. Because I hadn't finished my first novel. I wasn't finishing my second novel. And my second novel was The Rag Witch. But it's my first published novel. This is the British cover. It actually came out in Australia in 1991. My books didn't start appearing in the UK until 2002. I'll come back to that a bit later, but I started off in Australia and then America much earlier. So that's the British cover of The Rag Witch. The Rag Witch took me 5 years to write, very off and on, because I was very slow, I think, to learn that I actually needed to finish it. I couldn't just be someone who was always writing a novel. You actually got to finish them sometimes. But The Rag Witch came out in Australia in 1991. It wasn't really a success. It did okay. It got some good reviews. It sold a print run and went very quickly out of print. And a friend of mine at that time said to me, well, I guess you're just going to be a one-book wonder. It's a very good friend. Only very good friends are allowed to say stuff like that. But this amongst other things, I think spurred me on to continue writing. And after The Rag Witch, my next book was Sabriel, which is really the book that changed everything for me, because even though it got off to a slow start in Australia and then America, it just kept on going and it kept on going and kept on going. And then eventually, I made this myself just the other day. Eventually, I made this of all these are all the British covers of all my books. I actually made it so I can go back to Australia and throttle my friend with it. Just to show him I'm not a one-book wonder. But and actually, you can tell that I put this together when I was a bit jet-lagged, because I think one of them's upside down somewhere along here.
Yeah, you've got some on it.
Yeah, so obviously I shouldn't be allowed to make things like this. My brother, who's an animator and has an animation studio, offered to make me a beautiful PowerPoint presentation of all my covers. I said, no, I don't want one of those. I want a bodgy, sticky tape cover. I think that works better. But I look back at all these books, and I do wonder how I managed to write them. Every time I finish a book, I'm astonished that I've actually managed to do so, which sounds a bit strange when you look at it. I've written a lot of books, but every single time I'm still astonished that I have in fact managed to finish another one. I'm also standing up talking to people like here. I'm also quite astonished that people want to listen to me talk about my books as well. So I'm always very pleased that that is in fact the case. So I had quite a slow start in becoming a published author, and it continued slow because one of the things I left out when showing between the Ragwitch and Sabriel, that this looks like the Ragwitch came out and then Sabriel came out. There's actually a gap of about 4 years there, and in that space there should be another cover for the second book that the book I wrote after the Ragwitch, which also has never been published. So even after my first novel came out, I couldn't get the next one published, which is kind of like a reversal of expectation. This was because I wrote a personal book, I guess, a book that I thought was a really great idea because it would suit my very eclectic reading tastes. And I wrote a thriller about a publisher who gets a manuscript, which is a Regency romance, which actually contains encoded data about this huge criminal conspiracy. And every second chapter was the Regency romance of the manuscript. So it was thriller, Regency romance, thriller, Regency romance, thriller, Regency romance. And I sent it around to, well, first of all, my existing publisher who published the Ragwitch. And they said, well, we really like the thriller part, we really like the Regency romance part, we really hate the way they go together. Because your thriller readers aren't going to like the Regency romance, the Regency romance readers aren't going to like the thriller. I actually think they were possibly right then, possibly wrong now, and things flow together so much. But I couldn't sell it to anybody. So once again, my one book wonder friend was, one book wonder, wandering around. And so there was that gap as well. So you just never know how an author's career flows. You can look at all my books now and think, well, it looks pretty straightforward. I just wrote books and got them published and it just kept on going. But in actual fact, it wasn't like that. And I'm always very well aware that you just never know how things will go. I love writing books. I hope I get to keep writing them for a very long time. But you never know what can happen. You're only as good as your last book, and then you're taken out the back and shot.